Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for today's SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and thank you again for being a part of our weekly sessions where we take a look at three important stories in this past week's news, international ed news, and we're looking forward to sharing with you what our thoughts are on a couple of the relevant pieces of news that we see each year around this time, and that has to do with obviously open doors. Before we get too deep into this, I do want to make a shout out to those that are watching on the or listening on the podcast, those that have been downloading it on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, Podbean, whatever your favorite platform is. Thank you for making us a part of your podcast journey. We're looking forward to today going into some details on the open doors data. Obviously, this is the week. It comes out on Mondays during International Education Week, and some fantastic data that was presented on Monday. Some slightly surprising data on the overall numbers, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit more detail. Before we get into that, though, I do want to drop a link in the comments section here for our newsletter that comes out on Mondays each week. It's called all the SMIE news fit to share, and that covers social media and international ed news that I've been collecting over the past week. It comes out on Mondays, 9 a.m. It goes to your inbox and it has my takes on those topics, whatever the news stories might be in social media or international ed news, and how those might be impacting U.S. institutions. So I encourage you all to subscribe to that newsletter if you're not already, so getting that in your inboxes. For those who aren't aware of SMIE Consulting, we do social media and international ed consulting that has to do primarily with inbound international student recruitment efforts that your institution or organization may be involved in. Help you get connected with different resources and in the right markets that might be able to best help you achieve your institutional or organizational goals internationally. So let's jump into what we're talking about today. With International Education Week starting on Monday, the kickoff event every year is the Open Doors press briefing. And for those who aren't familiar, Open Doors is a collaborative project between the Institute of International Education, funded by the U.S. Department of State, and the International Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs through grants to the Institute of International Education. This event, hosted in D.C., involves members of the State Department, messages from Department of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, a short snippet from President Trump related to China, and some other dignitaries talking about the impact of international education. This year featured a student from Colombia who had been advised through Education USA, had come on opportunity funds and scholarships to the United States, and has been doing tremendously well since she arrived from Colombia. And very excited that for the first time in my memory, and having been a part of Open Doors briefings going back to 2008, 2009, being either physically there or watching the live stream, Education USA got an incredible shout out throughout the event, and really encouraged, particularly from State Department officials who were part of that event, referencing Education USA several times as one of the most significant pieces in what the U.S. government is doing to move international education efforts forward in these difficult times. So with Open Doors this year, in fact, on the Education USA front, a colleague of mine I used to work with at State, he's moved back to private industry. Yeah, he made a comment to me the other day during the briefing that and they mentioned this during the presentations on Monday, during the Open Doors discussions, that the State Department had money this year that they've given to IIE to contract with a global marketing firm for an international campaign to promote the United States as a destination market for international students, and that really hasn't happened ever in the time that I've been working with Education USA and State Department. They've done some video projects, but nothing on a global marketing campaign through an independent company. So that's going to be interesting to see how that develops, and that's coming up in the next year or so. So we'll keep our eyes tuned for what that might look like for U.S. and overseas markets. So in terms of what Open Doors does each year, obviously you have the data tables that are just for data geeks like me. It can be really exciting to kind of sink your teeth into and look at past year's history and top markets. And kudos to IIE and the research team there that they put together not only the standard fast facts sheet that outlines top 25 markets, top 20 destination universities in the United States, gives the 10-year overall trends, gives the percentage of U.S. higher education population that are international, gives the new international student enrollment data that we were all paying particularly close attention to. And that, for the first time in a while, has been slightly more positive than it has been. And that referred to only a 0.9% drop in new international enrollments for the 2018-2019 academic year. And that's one thing with Open Doors, keep in mind, it is previous year's academic data that's collected for this report. We'll be hearing probably in the next week or two from the Department of Homeland Security and their See This by the Numbers report. They're overdue for one this year. They only did one in March, should have done one in the fall, but didn't. So this will be for hopefully coming out in early December, if not right before Thanksgiving, where we'll take a look at the actual CDIS numbers, real-time data from December or late November. So, but Open Doors data is a year previous data. So, not unsurprising that last academic year there was still a drop in new international students coming in fall 2018. But the overall numbers, surprisingly, and the only reason we can say that surprisingly, is that all the reports have been, well, over half of universities have seen decreases, but that meant others were either stable or increased, so did those balance off? And apparently, according to the new enrollment data, new student enrollment data from overseas, yes, that's likely the case with only a 0.9% drop. But the overall numbers were up and a very microscopic amount, 0.05%. That equates to less than 1,000 students. It's about, looking at the numbers, a little less than 400 students more this year as compared to last year. So where are those numbers coming? Certainly not undergrad. That's down 2.4%. Graduate enrollments were down 1.3%. Non-degree ESL type programs, exchanges were down 5%. OPT is where the only reason why the overall numbers didn't take a dip last year, and that showed an increase of 9.6%. So according to that data, overall numbers are still are in the upward trajectory. Probably likely going to see a drop off next year when we see the impact of 3 years of OPT delays, 3 years of new international student enrollment drops. Probably be the first year next year where we'll see a net decrease. And for those who have been in the game a while, you'll remember back post 9/11, though our institutions were certainly feeling it in fall 2001, not so much, but 2002, 2003, the actual decrease didn't happen until 2004 or 5. So that's something to just keep in the back of our minds. We've had this bad period of new international enrollments down that probably won't show up in an overall decline until next year. So it's only because of OPT numbers still going up that we had a net increase in the total number of international students. And that's 4 years in a row now where since 2015-16, there have been over 1 million international students studying in the U.S. So still by far the #1 destination. And one of the things that as part of the Open Doors package of information, there's some fantastic PDFs you can download that are country-level reports on the top 25 sending countries, as well as regional reports to find out where the numbers really are. So great to sink your teeth into. If you're looking for more graphics, I've just posted the link in the comments section on the Facebook page to some infographic type visuals that you can use as you talk about international education on your campuses, in your communities, to potential donors, whatever it might be, to help with what you're doing. So definitely encourage you to get into the data quite a bit because there's a lot to see here. In the top 25 countries that are part of the Open Doors open doors process here. We see some really interesting things going on with certain countries where India and China are still increasing overall, and that's likely due to their numbers on the OPT side. But South Korea is down, Saudi Arabia is down considerably, 16.5%. For the first time in I don't know how long, Taiwan has actually increased at a fairly healthy clip, 4.1%. So that might be a market to, if you haven't already seen or been investing in Taiwan, that might be a market to continue your actions in. Brazil has again jumped up. They've grown 9% in the past year. And Nigeria, we see up over 5% in a year-on-year numbers. Further down, 20, I see Bangladesh with a healthy 10% growth, and Pakistan at 22nd, in the top 22nd of the top 25 at over 5% growth itself. So those 5 countries outside the top 2, Taiwan, Brazil, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, are certainly ones to keep an eye on, and would be certainly, I think, wise for universities to be considering those as potential markets if you're not already investing in them, to start exploring them as potential markets for your institution. So a lot of potential there, and some great data to support your case there. The PDFs for those top 25 countries can be downloaded, and we'll talk a little bit in a minute about China and India, and there as number 1 and number 2 as student country of origins for international students studying in the United States. You actually find with China, they're close to over 369,000 international students in this past academic year, contributing over almost $15 billion to the U.S. economy, just China alone. So I talk about export industries and ones that could be significantly damaged with any further erosion of political ties between China and the U.S. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, what that looks like. But with China, you continue to see the overall numbers, and where actually we saw with China where they did decrease, they were up still in undergraduate and graduate numbers and OPT numbers, but where they saw the biggest decreases for Chinese students coming to the U.S. was in non-degree. So I'm likely assuming that's going to be ESL programs and exchanges that might have been hurt. They were down 5.4% in the past academic year. And you can get this all from the PDFs, country-level PDFs that IIE makes available for open doors data. It also has, in the past, it's had information on academic fields of study, but that's not part of this equation here. It just has level of study. So interesting to see that, just on broad strokes. India, where they've seen growth, is with undergraduates. There's 1,500 more undergraduate Indian students studying in the U.S. this past year as opposed to 2017-18. That's up 6.3%. Non-degree studies for Indian students were actually up. The small numbers, we went from 1,800 to 2,200, but that's up 18%. And OPT continues to drive up at 12.3%. So there, a lot of the STEM OPT Indian students are in that mix. So India's rate of growth, and we'll talk more about this in the next topic, is something that has actually overtaken China in terms of student numbers to the United States in terms of the rate of growth. They were 5.4% last year. Now they're slowed a bit to 2.9%, but still on an upward trajectory. And that's an area where I thought there would be substantially more of a decrease, but luckily enough, that has not been the case. So let's move on to topic 2, and this is probably one of the better articles I've seen on this topic, a very in-depth review on universities, neo-nationalism, and the China threat. This was, and China threat in quotations. This comes out of University World News from Jenny Lee. It's a very comprehensive article focusing not just on China, but just on, in general, neo-nationalism in different countries and different destination markets, the impact that's having. There's with the profiling that's been going on related to Chinese students and scholars in the United States, stereotypes of them being spies. It goes in depth into some of these stories that we've covered quite a bit here on the Roundup. We want what I think is really valuable here in this section is how universities are responding in the United States and abroad. There's a nice section on here that talks about obviously the ties between U.S. institutions and Chinese institutions have been very deep, and have certainly been ones that we've seen quite a lot of movement on over the last 2 decades. Well, we talked in the past here on the Roundup about the 1+2+1 programs that began in the early 2000s that were at a time when undergraduate Chinese students were not yet the norm of Chinese students coming to the United States, designed really to help address visa concerns at that point, where Chinese undergrads were not getting visas to come at that stage. So they were coming on J visas for 1 year, for 2 years in the middle of their degree program and returning to China with 2-year home residency requirements to finish their degrees. So that's what was an initial phenomenon in the early 2000s. That's changed, and obviously that period led to a lot of increases in university partnerships between Chinese and U.S. institutions. A lot of those are profiled in this article here that Jenny Lee has spent quite a bit of time going into detail. But institutions are really taking into consideration their ties to our Chinese partners, and that's the data that's coming out of this is certainly encouraging university leaders to fight the good fight with their elected officials, with members of Congress, with the government agencies that they're being subjected to now as this China threat, as Jenny properly alludes to it. There are cases of espionage that are proven, and that goes both ways. Certainly more prevalent probably on the Chinese side coming here, but the fact that these things are happening around the world and getting publicity in other countries, like we talked about last week in Belgium, in Australia, in the UK, other countries, that these things are high on the list of concerns from government agencies. A Senate committee just heard stories on intellectual property theft at the university level during hearings this week. The other hearings going on Capitol Hill, aside from what the House is doing currently. So there's a real need for U.S. institutions to protect their own interests here. And senior international officers certainly been on the front lines of this for quite a while. But it really will bring to light on the institutional campus perspective how valued internationalization is on those campuses, and some colleges will decide it's not worth the fight. And it's going to be sad to see that happen, but it's a reality that may very well occur. So we're going to keep our eyes on that story. Obviously, it's a very sticky one, a lot of complex issues involved here. I know a number of colleagues that are concerned. There's just so many stories week after week that seem to be just painting Chinese students that are now being targeted for this, for being Chinese and part of a government conspiracy. But the one thing that Jenny points out in her article that kind of contradicts the stereotype about Chinese students as potential spies. And there's also evidence of Chinese students demonstrating the Xi is not my president campaign, and that's President Xi of China, XI, not Xi, SHE. So that is certainly something that those things exist, but there are still challenges even today. There's something in the news about a speech or in Chronicle, I think it was today, or Inside Higher Ed, about how a speech on campus, on Columbia's campus, was canceled. That was going to be critical of the Chinese Communist Party and some of their clampdown efforts, ranging as far back as Tiananmen to the current Uyghur situations in Shenzhen province. So there's a lot going on there, and we obviously can't cover all that today, but it's not a monolithic approach. A monolithic approach towards any culture is wrong, but certainly with regards to China, we're best served by not taking that approach in higher ed and certainly showcasing the positive things that are occurring on our campuses related to China that are anything but what is being highlighted in the news. So last stop on the tour, we're going to focus on India and really their role in international student mobility. Now, we've talked in the past about China, and that everybody knows China. China's the number one source of international students for in the English-speaking world. They are it. From Australia to the U.S. to the U.K., increasingly Canada, New Zealand, that's where they get the majority of their students. But India is now, it's no secret now that India, other than now crossing the 200,000 threshold to the United States, they overall are sending, as of July 2018, according to the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, this article from ISEF, the ISEF Monitor, has some, they got another great source of information on international student destinations. They have in their most recent reports showcasing that over 753,000 Indian students were studying abroad as of July 2018. And that, there's some rounding of the numbers there, but that 72% of those 750,000 plus are going to 5 destinations. The U.S., as we said, over 200,000. Canada, 124,000. Australia, 87,000, Saudi Arabia, 70,000, and UAE, 50,000. So Saudi and UAE kind of are ones that on that list of destinations for Indian students certainly pop off the radar a little bit for what we in the Western world would think. Well, why would they want to go to Saudi Arabia and UAE? Anyone who's traveled in those regions knows that there's a significant expat population of Indians working in the Gulf, in the UAE, Qatar, Saudi as well. That there are Indian schools all over those countries as well to accommodate students that have come, families that have resettled in those areas for work. And they are now taking advantage of that at the university level by enrolling in post-secondary education in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So if you combine them, actually, Saudi Arabia and UAE for the number of Indian students, they're roughly equal to the number of Indian students in Canada right now. So, with Canada being the second leading destination for Indian students, so that's significant. So what I think is important when it comes to India, understanding India, is knowing that really in a post-secondary world for Indian students, their options are very limited. Even though there are hundreds, if not thousands, of colleges and universities, post-secondary institutions in India, the top institutions where most students want to go, when they take their national exams at the end, we talked about the Gaokao for Chinese students, but which is to get into the top schools in China, for Indian students looking to get into the IITs or the business management programs, their rates are on that end of secondary school exam, their standard 12s, they are looking at closing admission to any student that gets lower than a 98% on those exams. So we're talking people who are in the United States. If you're getting a 97%, to be shut out of top universities would be unthinkable. So to get a sense of the numbers here, at the recent ISEF Berlin workshop, one of the principal consultants with TC Global, that used to be called the Chopras, explained that for senior secondary students in India, that is 14 to 18-year-olds, there are 88.5 million students in high school, basically, in India right now, and 35 million in higher education in India now. You think about in the United States, obviously India has more than 1 billion, 3 billion, 4 people. So 35 million in higher education. Obviously that dwarfs the United States. We're at about 20, according to just under 20 million students are enrolled in post-secondary education in the United States. So India is 150% more students in higher ed already. But so the challenge is finding places for top students that it's seeing and even this group, Chopper's group, is seeing a big shift now towards undergraduates. A number of undergraduates going abroad every year over the last few years. When she says when she started her career, 15% it was 15% undergraduate, 85% postgraduate, but now it's much higher. I think overall in the United States, the Indian numbers are still relatively skewed to graduate students. In fact, we're looking at 44%, a little over 44% of the current Indian students in the U.S. are graduate. 12% are undergraduate. So we're still in a market in the U.S. at least where there is it's still an undergraduate, but those numbers on the undergraduate side have been increasing year on year for the last 5 or 6 years. So I think those numbers are only going to go up, and there's certainly a lot of tours that focus on Indian national schools that have sprung to life in the last decade that are fully subscribed or soon to be fully subscribed just because the demand is there. Demand for the students wanting to get exposed to U.S. undergraduate institutions, not just graduate, where likely their parents have went to the United States, and you see similar trends, not obviously the same, when you look at what happened in China in the early 2000s, where you had a generation of Chinese students that were educated in the 80s and 90s that came to the U.S. for graduate programs. In the early 2000s, they were starting their own families and investing in their sons and daughters, son or daughter, to go abroad, and we're much more open to undergraduate experiences. And I think the same thing's happening in India now, and probably a 5, 10, 15-year delay in terms of the trend. But there was a time in the 90s when Chinese undergraduates were less than 5% of Chinese students studying in the U.S., and they are now over half. So I think there's India is up on a potential trajectory like that, but not certainly probably the volume. It would be fantastic if that developed, but I don't see that happening quite as quickly as it did with the Chinese market. But you saw India, a number of Indian students going to Canada was significantly profiled in that ISEF report. What's interesting, kind of a side note to that, is when you look at Indian students going to Canada, that you see now that there's been kind of what was happening in Australia back in the early 2000s. There was quite a glut of Indian students in Australia. At that time, they might have been the number one country of origin for international students in Australia. But they were flocking to the community college, or the equivalent of vocational education in Australia. And that was causing a lot of backlash, that these students weren't qualified, they're just coming to emigrate, and just quickest path to work rather than actual coming for education. So there's perhaps some of that happening in Canada now. Over the last couple of years, we've profiled some stories here on the Roundup of particularly the college level in Canada. Community colleges, vocational colleges, are at 40, 50, 60% international, and a good chunk of those are coming from India, with similar trajectories that they were pursuing down in Australia, coming for vocational education and easy paths to citizenship, or at least work and permanent residency. So that has led in the last couple of years to Canada actually rejecting friendly Canada, rejecting 36% of student visas for Indians in the last year. So that's an increase from 29% to 36% in the last year. So now fully over a third of Indian applicants for study permits in Canada are being rejected. And for some of the similar causes we talked about with Indian students in China, in Australia, there's talk they're now considered at risk or higher risk because of English and financial ability. So that probably, my guess is, there are similar concerns north of the border in Canada that's led to increased rejection rates for student visa applicants there. So obviously a very interesting time in international ed, and we're going to keep our fingers on the pulse here at the Roundup, and looking forward to continuing the conversations with you. Do check back with us next week, Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, for the next edition of as our Thanksgiving Roundup. We'll share some of the things we're thankful for this year. but we're also looking forward to continuing a little more in-depth view on how the press has been reacting to Open Doors in next week's Roundup, and hearing more from you and what your thoughts are on these topics. So for now, have a wonderful day and good rest of the week.